Welcome to another episode of Have You Heard the Latest podcast? We're going back to the Tim Ferriss Show this week again. He had on Walter Isaacson, who is an author and journalist, and specifically he authored several books looking at the lives of Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, and Leonardo Da Vinci, some of the greatest minds of our human existence. So, Tom, let me ask you, what was a big takeaway you had from this podcast?
So I thought that the main takeaway was that some of our favorite heroes, Da Vinci, Ben Franklin, Steve Jobs, they are thinking in a pattern, or they're thinking across they're thinking across fields. So rather than in our modern times when we silo ourselves off and we want to focus on only science or only art. And in fact, we almost don't want experts in, if someone's an expert in finance, we don't want them commenting on science. If someone's a great poet, we don't want to hear what they have to say, about science or math or what have you. And our school system, of course, compartmentalizes all of the subjects, and then our careers silo the subjects. But yet, the folks at the pinnacle, I mean, you can't get any better than Da Vinci, Jobs, and Ben Franklin. And all of these folks are curious across fields, and fields that we often consider like hobbies, like doing art, playing piano, drawing, and so forth. It seems like these folks integrated, art, science, different fields all together, and it seems like their main contributor to their success is in fact their learning horizontally. So I think that stuck out to me because of how little that goes on and how much we really don't talk about poetry and math being related at all. So let me toss it to you, right? Given you grew up in the same area I did, what do you think about the siloing versus learning across?
I'd have to say I'm a pretty large fan of it. And it's funny because when Isaacson brought this up, I actually thought back to the Altucher Kwik podcast. Mm-hmm. Because there's a point in that podcast where Kwik and Altucher are going back and talking about how being in a field can actually hinder you because you have all of your own biases from that field already. Whereas bringing in a new person who's not as familiar with that field can kind of liven things up because they have this new perspective. Now, unfortunately, as people, right, we only have ourselves. Like, we can't bring in a new CEO to run Tom or Glenn. But you can kind of cheat that system by being open to everything and having that sort of horizontal learning, and it can change your perspective.
So, for example, in what you just said right there, so is what Jim Kwik, his point is like, if you're not in an industry, but then you go into that, like if it's healthcare, and you don't have a healthcare background, but you go into the industry with your naivety, not knowing all of what, how it's supposed to be, you all of a sudden have the ability to see things that the folks in the healthcare industry may not have seen because they're already living and breathing it. And you're sort of saying that similarly within our own lives. Even if you're a math person, you may have insights from poetry that give you like a new lens. And then you take that into your other fields, and then it exposes, perhaps new patterns, deeper learning. The implication of the horizontal learning is very interesting here, because what could poetry and math have in common, right? Is it like it's some, I guess Da Vinci believes it's some kind of universal logic or universal way, right? So, what do you think
well, that's
about
what,
that?
the Vitruvian Man was like a...
How do you interpret that?
Isaacson brings it up. What, Vitruvian Man?
Exactly.
From what sort of perspective?
So, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be some kind of art and science coming together, right? In that picture, because it's like mathematically the man has proportions, and there's a square and a circle element to it, And
Yep.
it's supposed to be some combination of visual art, but yet like mathematically congruent with universal principles, right? Something like that?
Yes. Yeah, and it's like this thing, if you've ever heard of the concept of like the perfect ratio. There's this idea that there's a certain shoulder to waist ratio within a person that is like visually appealing to the eye. Now, that's obviously the mixture of art and science, or art and math, because you have the person, which would be the art, so to speak, and then you have the math, exactly, the beauty of the individual body, and then you'd have the math of what are the hard numbers, shoulders that are X inches across and a waist that is X inches across. So I would say it definitely lines up with how thinking works, and it actually is a beautiful way of connecting that whole left brain, right brain idea. I view processes in a very orderly manner. I view the day as sort of taking me and being on an adventure, and really both things are getting you towards the same goal. So containing them within one piece of art like that could be what brilliance really is, right?
No, it's pretty interesting. You mentioned left-right brain, and
Yeah.
when they describe the pineal gland, which is like a newer part of our evolutionary process. It's a new part of the brain. It supposedly has some mediation between the left and right brain. It sort of sits between the two, and it's interesting that these human beings are sort of acting like the pineal gland in the sense that they're sitting in between the two. And it's very interesting because in my life, I don't think I really do this. Like, I can be a little bit left-brained, and I suppose it's like, do I like art? Well, I keep reading nonfiction and no fiction. And as I get older, I'm starting to see that perhaps true intelligence is not just the pursuit of quote-unquote left-brained specifics, but, knowledge, as we call it so often, right? It's actually like, it's a blending of knowledge and whatever, like the quote-unquote right brain, sort of like, how much poetry do we read anymore? I never read poetry. How much nonfiction and news do I read? I read it every night. So I am inspired by these gentlemen from that perspective of like, wow, maybe I want to get some artistic elements into my life. And I suppose it could help with my, more orderly endeavors. Were you inspired similarly?
Well, first, let me massively disagree with you.
Oh, beautiful.
When you say that you're really process-oriented and you only read nonfiction, listen, Tom, I've heard you talk about nature and the universe, and that none of that stuff is rooted in hard numbers or any of that jazz. Like,
That's true.
That is your artwork. And this is specifically something Isaacson also said, where about curiosity, and he talked about lists that Da Vinci would make all the time of like little things he was curious about. And he talks about one specific thing Da Vinci said was, he was like, what like the tongue of a woodpecker looks like. And it's like, well, that's someone just observing nature and being curious. And it's like, well, that's art. I mean, it's not like you're necessarily some super process-oriented thing there. And like, that's something you do all the time. You do it way more than I do it personally.
Absolutely. Here's the interesting thing that I agree. So I suppose is what I was gleaning on there is that there are times in my life when I anchor my curiosity, let's say, not necessarily in like curiosity for itself, but although perhaps there may be instances where that is the case, it feels like sometimes I'm overly anchoring myself to a left brain goal, like starting a business, making money, and like I don't really like fun art unless it's fulfilling that mission. And although I will say, as I grow older, I definitely feel like blending them, and embracing those elements even more. So I suppose I'm perhaps reflecting on, a little bit of like my alignments can be a little bit like focused on material, tangible things. Whereas Da Vinci, like with the woodpecker comment, that is just pure curiosity. Like, he's trying to work his mind for the love of the craft, which I find that I definitely do that. But I'll just say at least there's times when I'm not in it for the love of the craft, where I feel very sort of American capitalist, like I want to make it over the hill, and then I'll relax. That's sort of like what the mind can tell you. So yeah, perhaps I'm trying to untangle what that is, because my lists are often things to do, not awesome
it's a to-do list.
Totally. Now I will say, in those times, like you said, where you watch a nature documentary and you see things in nature that remind you of the human struggle, and then they carry over. Those areas, I'm loving that. I really am. So, and let me flip it on you, because you're someone who I think of as typically orderly and reliable. So, how do you accept this information that perhaps you could get even further with more, art in your life?
I would say it's something that relates to perspective, for me at least. Like, it's how you view art within a certain context. Like, I too get that thing about nature when I'm watching like nature documentaries, and they display habits of different animals that like are so human you'd think. I was actually watching one yesterday. Our friend Ben sent us this thing about chimpanzees and equality, and there's this chimpanzee and it's getting a cucumber, or actually no, it was a smaller monkey, but it's getting like a cucumber, which is like pretty decent, and then the one next to it for the same exact task is handed a grape, which is like super sick to a monkey. And this other little monkey with this cucumber is like outraged that this other monkey is getting a grape, and you're like, oh my god, that's just like a person. Like,
yes.
You're placing value on things, and you're upset that you can't too have that thing. So what I would say is, it's not necessarily hard art. Like, yes, paintings necessarily don't inspire me, but the vagueness and the craziness of the connectivity of our world that we have with animals and nature, like I would say that definitely inspires me, and that definitely causes me to think less process oriented.
How about when Isaacson mentions something like you can dwell on a mathematical formula, and similarly you can dwell on like a line from poetry, and the brain is untangling them. And I could see how within the same human being, if you put yourself through both the interpretive, soft part of art and poetry, and then you put yourself through the sort of the objective part of math, that brain is going to be working with those two different processes. You could see how that makes you stronger by trying to deal with both kinds of puzzles. And I would also say, I could see how it would be unbelievably exciting if you started to draw bridges between those two. And he mentions this point about feeling connected in the universe, specifically when you bridge the gap. Because then you're like, well, what could these two have in common? And frankly, I don't really know exactly what poetry and formulas have in common yet. But I could see how if there was a quote-unquote truth, that would be pretty exciting, because it has a universal element to it.
Yes. So, well, here, let's reveal a little inner thing here. Like,
Please.
Why did we come up with the idea for this sort of podcast? What is something we love talking about? The patterns we see when different people talk about the same things. How much do we love that?
It's electric. Electric.
That's inspiring. So you can see how patterns can be so empowering, because you realize it places order to the universe a little bit.
Dude,
You can recognize things and get a lay of the land a little bit better.
It's almost like there's a tangible goosebump kind of feeling that I get sometimes when you discover patterns across different speakers and entrepreneurs and scientists, and
yeah.
and philosophers and religions, and they wind up having like a very similar truth. Like when I hear Dominic Cruz talk about letting go, and then I hear Eckhart Tolle, talking about letting go, and then I hear creatives talking about letting go, and how whether you're actualizing yourself in a sport, actualizing yourself sort of out of a depression, or actualizing yourself into a creative endeavor, that there's this moment of like, oh wow, I have to relax, I can't force it. And that's just an example of knowledge that is derived from different arenas that seemingly, and here's the magic, they're seemingly unrelated. And then when you get that common denominator, you're like, oh my goodness, this is a gold mine. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like an aha moment.
Yes, that pattern recognition across different fields creates a tangible excitement.
Oh, without a doubt. And I actually want to bring you back to a thing you mentioned a couple times now. Is you're talking about Da Vinci, and you're talking about his like intelligently and deliberately working his brain. And Isaacson brings up this idea that Da Vinci was very fond of, and that kind of crosses the span with Franklin and Jobs as well. And it was about questioning received wisdom. Did that resonate with you at all?
Oh, yes. Do you want to comment on it first, or?
Yeah, so yeah, definitely will. We talk about the educational system, and we talk about like this, not necessarily taking in everything you immediately receive as being a fact, just because you hear it, and just because someone's speaking from like a position of authority, supposedly, that you should then just basally accept it. And that may not be the best way. So, Tom, what do you think is the best way to handle things?
So, received wisdom.
Yep.
The thing that was interesting in this case was the destructive element of received wisdom. So, you can stifle creativity if you have a bunch of youngsters, and they've and they're being creative, and then you base or an individual, let's say, is being creative, and then your response is like, no, that's not how it is, or oh no, that's not correct. I mean, you realize the damage that you're doing, because you're saying to this creative being, you can't trust what you're coming up with. You have to trust what we've already come up with. Now, that's true when it comes to, like, don't cross the street in traffic. So, like, we need received wisdom, but paradoxically, it's almost like it's all received wisdom. And in fact, life is about discovering wisdom. And to your point about training the brain, what do you mean by that, right? It's training an individual discovering the patterns instead of, like, being handed down. And I really reacted emotionally to this idea of, wow, we are kids day in and day out are being washed away of their creativity in the name of received wisdom. And you're like, no wonder there's not new ways of thinking emerging to solve problems sometimes, because it's like, well, we're discouraging it from the get. So and then the question would be, how should it be? And I would like to just bring in, I believe it's Eric Weinstein, who mentions that how can you teach how can you teach big ideas? Well, if you just go out and tell the kid this is how it is, you're undermining their process. So instead, you almost need to sort of curate interesting problems or put interesting things in front of them that you kind of know, okay, this is going to lead to a wisdom, a universal wisdom, but you have to have them uncover it. And as teachers and as adults, as folks that are not kids, we have to be okay too with kids trying new things to some extent. So
yeah, it's like, watch any parent with like a 3 to 5 year old, It's brutal because it's usually this war of wills where it's like the kid wants to do one thing and the parent wants to make them do another thing. And look, there's times, I mean, you got places to be, the kid needs to go to school sometimes, and like, yeah, you gotta wrangle them, don't get me wrong here. But you see other times where the kid will be like holding a pen weird, or like doing something with like a cup, and they're like, no, put the cups over here. It's like, well, I mean, is it a big deal if they're not ordering everything exactly how you, the 30-year-old, would like it?
And you think about how kids could renew us. Like, like to your point about the naivety that can be beneficial from a Jim Kwik industry perspective. Well, what are kids? Kids are human beings entering our world, quote unquote, that we've created with all of our all of our accumulated knowledge, and they should have this naivety, this new perspective that should be renewing us and saying, "Hey, wait a second, maybe we don't have to do things the way that we always said." There is not room for that, though. So instead, you have Da Vinci being born out of wedlock, not going through formal schooling because of that, right? I believe that's the implication. And so therefore he finds himself creative because somehow his bad circumstance got him away from the formal schooling, and he winds up being grateful for the whole thing. So, man, if that isn't a warning for the times with modern kids going through our education system and then school and then careers, silo. Da Vinci was trying to get away from that.
Yeah, and you see something, and this is very obvious that we as a culture have always thought about Steve Jobs, and then Isaacson talking about Da Vinci and Franklin. There's like this healthy distrust of the box, the box we're all put in. Like, those guys had a healthy distrust of the system. Like, wait a second, why are we necessarily accepting this thing? Are we accepting it because it's valid and it's a great idea? Or are we accepting it because it's always been done that way?
Exactly.
We know that's a common problem in every realm of life, politics, group settings, all of it. It's like, why are we doing this thing? Well, someone way back when came up with it, and it's just always been done that way. It's like, okay, I mean, that is not a creative mindset, right?
And you're right, is what gets wrapped up in it is our own Darwinian pursuit to survive, to make money, to pay for our families, have a comfortable life. So it's like there's very little incentive for folks to be creative at a certain point in their lives because they're so tied down and benefiting from the existing systems. So it's like, it's a very tricky process because creativity's dangerous. It's saying maybe I want all the way from maybe I want to quit my job to maybe I want to change the industry. And it's like, well, that may not work, right? Or maybe you want to change the political system. So that, creativity has a healthy destructive element. We're not getting to enjoy it because I believe folks are wrapped up in their day-to-day lives, and we all have our needs to want to be comfortable and have money in the bank and not have our bosses dislike us because we're pushing the system, right? And life is hard and we're busy. And one of the things we're losing for sure is creativity in the name of order. And it's fascinating that these high-end thinkers are on their fingers on the pulse, and they're literally saying, no. You have to break down those walls. You have to be naturally curious. And it's a shame that our school system conflates natural curiosity with, like, studying for a test. Like, one is learning and one is not learning. It's not learning to just rinse and repeat and be siloed, right? It's not really learning because it doesn't stick with you. It doesn't excite you. So I love that. Thank goodness that the highest end folks in this world are those that trust their own curiosity, because life is so much more fun when you do that.
Yeah, but let me also say
please.
this,
Yeah.
and let me make things a little less scary for people.
Please.
Because you mentioned, like, oh, everyone, they want to make sure their family's going to be okay. They want to make sure they've got a job and they're secure, so to speak. But, and I'm that type of person too. Like, I'm pretty processy, right? We like our things in order. However, there's this weird mixture, and I think we can draw this back to the whole left and right brain thing, and we can talk about it now with creativity. Where, yes, there's a huge problem overall in the country with things being necessarily too orderly, especially in our educational system.
Yep.
And there needs to be room for creativity. But it's important to keep in mind that these minds weren't just these raw, all over the place, crazy creative types. Exactly. They were obsessed also with making lists. Like, what is more orderly than a list?
Exactly.
Like, they were actually even boiling their creative things, Da Vinci specifically, into lists. Like, it shows that you can marry the two of them.
Absolutely.
You don't need to be some raging artist. Yes, exactly.
Exactly. I could not agree more.
So you can see how that can work. Yes.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
Isaacson says the warning about folks thinking they're like Einstein, right? He's like, people come up to, I'm creative. I think out of the box, just like Einstein. And he's like, well, remember, Einstein knew a lot about what was in the box as well. And
yes,
the image I got when you were saying both is like, like a zipper. You need both sides for the thing to zip up. I completely agree. You need organic order in your life to maintain, your basic life. I mean, we have built structures for a reason, and they work to some extent. We have a great amount of prosperity, and people need routine, and people need to learn what's in the box. So it's like, to your point about received wisdom initially, it's a funny balancing act. We need received wisdom, and yet we also need to be able to have the room to break it. Totally.
Yeah, it's that sort of in-between sort of thing where it's like, yes, on one hand, you need received wisdom, but, and I guess this is just a general thing, is like, just don't be blind. It's like, the whole idea of having interest in the world, it's like, well, don't be blind to the world. Like, don't be blind to things that are outside of your realm.
Yep.
But also, like, don't be blind to just buck things because they are trends also.
Yep.
Like, actually weigh things out.
Yes, exactly. Marry the two impulses.
Yes. And that things can actually work that way. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We're stuck right now in society in a very, like, one or the other. I'm creative. I'm not really the creative type.
Exactly.
It's a matter of both things.
So, did you find it interesting when Steve Jobs was asked about what his greatest product was? And his response was that the team he built. Did that take you back as well?
Yeah, so Jobs, they're talking to Jobs, I guess it's Isaacson is interviewing him, and he's like, oh, what's your greatest product, what's your greatest invention, and you expect Jobs is going to be like, oh, the iPhone, the iPod, something like that. And Jobs is like, well, like, yeah, they're hard, but building a team is even harder. And it was like, oh my God, as a member of a team, it's like, you're like, yes, Steve, I completely agree with you on that one. How'd you feel about that?
Well, it certainly piggybacks nicely with the unification of the left and right brains. In theory, a lot of us have a natural, and Ray Dalio talks about this as well. Some folks are more creative, some folks are more reliable. In particular, those are the two kind of poles that Ray Dalio talks about. So when Jobs mentioned this, I imagine he's considering pairing people with different strengths, and then as a team, creativity and these products that we expect Jobs to answer with, like, isn't the iPhone the most important thing? It's like, no, well, the iPhone grows out of the team, not the other way in reverse.
Yes.
So
it's like the iPhone can't create anything else, but a team can.
Of course. So it totally recentered me, and it draws upon a subtle theme, which is that these folks are quote unquote geniuses, right? But they are doing things that many of us can consider. So when he said team, which is a human thing and not like crazy technology, like it's not like Steve Jobs says, well, the code I wrote back in this period, something that you can't relate to. And similarly with your point about lists, like what do both lists and teams, right, have in common, for example? It's like these are things that you and I can use in our lives, and it makes these geniuses more approachable.
Ugh. Yeah, you can see why a guy like Dalio names his book Principles, because you realize that these great minds, these crazy successful people, like, yes, I'm sure their IQ, if you measured it, is well above average, don't get me wrong, but God, do they have some incredible processes, some incredible principles that are life principles. They're not these, like you said, it's not like Steve Jobs was saying, oh, well, this coding thing I came up with, and it's like, okay, well, that's not relatable. Dalio didn't, when way back, Ferriss was talking to Dalio, and asked Dalio, what are the things you remember? Dalio wasn't like, oh, there's this great financial thing. It wasn't that either. It was a human experience. These are things we can all do, right?
Right. So for example, in the investment world, what Dalio creates was called risk parity portfolio, which is a style of investing. And it's like, yes, that's his secret sauce, right? In investing, partially. Simultaneously, though, what is he passionate about? He's passionate about individuals on a team telling the truth to each other, because he knows what Jobs knows. If these human beings function well together and they bring together their different skill sets, reliability and creativity being a start to differentiating people, that out of that will emerge the creative works that we all want. So it's like, what comes first? Well, risk parity can't come until he's sitting around with people he trusts and they're talking about, investing in an honest way, and they're correcting each other and saying, no, it's not actually like this, or what if we broke the norms? And very interestingly, part of what Ray Dalio does is he goes back to the drawing board of investing and takes a first principles approach, a very naive sort of take, if you will, and redesigns the whole thing. And to this day, his success is from that mix of like telling the truth, teams working together, and then also, though, that combination of naivety and going back in and looking with a fresh start, and then as a product you have the inventions. So all we see is the product, and we all want to just praise them for like being geniuses, but it's so interesting. They are just using regular humanity in a certain way and that's why it's so exciting, because it's like, oh wow, this is stuff I can do. I can make lists. I can have truth-telling teamwork that has different styles of human beings working together. So that's pretty damn exciting that these folks are using human things that we know about.
Yeah, it really grounds it in something you can do. And you just mentioned humanity, which brings me to another principle that Isaacson identified they kind of all had, and it was gratitude. It was this idea of gratitude, right? They talked about Da Vinci. You mentioned it earlier, how he was born out of wedlock and didn't have necessarily the easiest, most standard upbringing, and how he was able to achieve gratitude with it. How do you feel about gratitude as a possible core principle?
Another very moving part. Extremely happy you brought it up. I believe Isaacson says something like fear stops when gratitude begins. Am I right on that? Is that from this podcast? something like that.
I've definitely heard it
Okay,
before.
perfect.
I'm not sure if it was him, though.
Because they kind of blend in a little bit. So, fear stops when gratitude begins. All of them use so it's funny, like in the human brain, we get nervous about life, and especially when you're taking risks. And we, it's easy to be afraid. We're sensitive. We're fleshy creatures. Where things can change immediately in one tragedy and so forth. Or one wrong move sometimes. So it's like, how does one get over fear? Well, gratitude is basically, it's appreciating. It's not asking for something new to happen in the future. It's not like hope, please let this happen. Gratitude is saying, up until this point, thank you for what has happened already. Things that can't be taken away. Things that are not expectations on the future, right? So it's like, what's fear? Fear is like, in the future, what I expect won't get there. And what is gratitude? It's saying, listen, forget expectations. World, universe, God, subconscious, whoever I'm talking to, right? Thank you for what has happened already. And then it's like, no one can take that away from me. It's already happened, and I'm happy about that happened. And that can restore a sense of calm, and we know that calm is the main weapon you need to go be creative, because you want to be channeling, thoughts from parts of your brain that if you're afraid, and that amygdala, that reptilian brain, if that's turned up to a high volume, you're not going to have the ability to be creative. So I love that gratitude was here, because, we hear about gratitude a lot in modern philosophy, but I love hearing that these entrepreneurs and these real doers, they use it just as much. So yeah, I loved it. How about yourself? I mean, do you find that gratitude is the same kind of antidote that they sort of talk about?
Yeah, and I think you really uncovered something interesting when you just compared gratitude and hope. So the way you framed it just now was that gratitude is about looking back at what has already occurred and being thankful that it has occurred, and hope is like this wishing and looking towards the future thing.
Yes.
And it got me thinking, what lies even beneath that is like, look what we're doing here. Unfortunately, all these guys are gone, right? Einstein, Da Vinci, Franklin, Jobs too, even. I mean, they're gone. But you could definitely see where you could say, well, shouldn't we be looking to the future? Shouldn't we only be concerned about where we're moving in the rise of technology and space travel and things like this? Like, what could you learn from Leonardo da Vinci? He existed in such a different world. And you could see how that sort of thinking is the opposite of gratitude, and how this idea of looking back also plays into this idea of patterns. So if you have the gratitude to understand that your life and existence as a whole has unfolded how it has unfolded, and it couldn't unfold any other way than how it has, and you accept that, you can take on this extra level of, in my opinion, appreciation for everything that has occurred, and you can then feel free to look at the figures, look at the history, and then gain this sort of awareness because of the information you're taking in, and then actually be able to apply those patterns you see. That's like, wow, it's like, I see what Da Vinci's talking about here. Like, this is something I've struggled with, or this is something I can relate to, and you see how that whole notion of gratitude and looking back can be an incredibly powerful tool in your life.
No, and I appreciate what you just did right there, which is you took a concept that functions at the individual level, like an individual person, and you sort of mentioned how society can talk more about AI and solving the future with advanced technology, but yet, like, when it comes to what we need on a day-to-day basis, Da Vinci has a lot to say, right? So I completely agree, man, and that's very interesting that we can be grateful, and it's sort of a looking back and being happy, with, wow, if things didn't things wouldn't be how they are now unless all those things happened. And as I recall, Isaacson mentions the feeling of luck that seems to coincide with this concept, that they felt lucky. The individual, Jobs, Da Vinci, each of them, that they felt lucky about their lives because they realized that, wow, I wouldn't be able to be in this current situation creating in this manner if it weren't for all the things behind me. And then I'm sure once you feel grateful, it's even easier to create. So there's probably a cycle, a self-reinforcing cycle. It's like you have gratitude, then you're calm, you can become creative, and now you're creative and you're happy and you're like, wow, how did this happen? Oh, well, thank you for what happened in the past. And gratitude and creativity, I haven't really heard linked like this before, but it makes perfect sense because the brain has to, if the amygdala, and this is Ray Dalio's like number one thing he always talks about, the amygdala, that reptilian fight or flight part of our brain, it can dominate. So gratitude sort of walks that back, and then you could take a step forward.
Yeah. No, that's actually an interesting point, that it kind of grounds us in our consciousness in a positive way, not in an existential crisis way.
Yes.
But in like yes, okay, I can be here, and I cannot necessarily be too driven by my initial emotions, and like you said, that reptilian kind of fight or flight brain.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening, at any point, you can think in your life about the huge evolution that occurred all the way back, since the Big Bang or since the beginning of the Earth, and all those millions of years of incubation for the bacteria to turn into the multicellular organism, whatever happens, right? And then all the human beings and all the generations and the fights for survival and all of that had to happen for us to be here, actually. So it's like, I love that gratitude and science can live together, because like you can be grateful for our basic history, which is like scientific and historical, but gratitude is kind of like emotion. It's an emotion. So you have the connection of the emotion to the order of how we got here. And it's pretty cool. Again, it's it's that mixing of art and science right there. It's like, oh wow, I feel good. Why do I feel good? Because thank you, whoever I'm thanking, right? I'm thanking like whoever, serendipity or whatever. But a lot of things had to happen. A lot of lives had to be lived for us to be here. That's pretty damn cool. And that's a truth that we walk around with on any regular Tuesday. You know what I mean?
Every day. It's with that I want to bring us to what our big takeaways were from the podcast, and what was the one thing that remains, and I'll begin with mine. Sure. And it was patterns. Patterns was the one thing I'll be taking away from this one. In that the more knowledge and the more horizontal learning you can take in over time, it's going to allow you to begin connecting these dots in your lives, because people are going to be teaching you the same lessons, they're going to be saying the same things, and they're going to come from all these different disciplines. And it makes, and this is important from a day-to-day standpoint, from a historical standpoint, it makes life so much more grounded and like less scary, to me at least, even, that it's like you're getting a map a little bit, and you get your place, that okay, everyone's saying this thing, like you get these universal truths, and you get a perspective on your own life and your own place in time and history. And by seeing those different patterns, like it's a very calming thing, because you don't feel this like on a boat lost at sea thing anymore. So that's my takeaway.
Yes, that feeling that you belong in this universe. Absolutely. Like we're all connected. Exactly. The takeaway I have is the humanity and the approachability of the genius and their techniques. So whether it's all these, whether it's making lists when you're nervous of all the things that I got to do, making lists of things you're curious about, it's like, hey, we can all make lists. When you're building a team, and it's like, well, what's the important thing about a team? Is it, hey, Ray, is it highest IQ, most? No. It's that. Yes, of course, that's part of it. But here's what it is. It's being honest within the group. And when you make mistakes and or you want to criticize a team member, for all those miscommunications that we all go through. It's like Ray Dalio, he just cleaned up, sort of day-to-day things. And that's what it seems like Jobs, Franklin, Da Vinci. What unlocked them? Yes, it's their abilities for sure, but it's these basic practices that we can all relate to that they just really took seriously. Like they actually kept, these journals or they actually practiced these little wisdoms and they compounded over time into, the geniuses that we know today. So that is really inspiring because it makes them approachable.
It does. So from those two big takeaways of humanity and patterns, I want to say thank you for listening. It's been another episode of Have You Heard the Latest Podcast? You can catch these every single Friday morning, 7 a.m., whether it's on YouTube or through the podcast app. So whatever is your means of listening, give us a subscribe. You'll be able to catch us there. And we love you.